The creation of art is the creation of order for the purpose of communication. Every age that has produced great art has imposed its own kind of order. From about 1140 to 1500 AD, people in many parts of Europe had particular ideas about what was real and what was valuable. And their art, through which we can see these ideas, emerged from a common base formulated by scholars and theologians into an order or style now called Gothic. In the Gothic idea of the universe, the physical world is not real. Men only know the world around them through their senses and powers of reason. What is real is the world of the spirit and the intentions of a Christian God. But God can only be known by faith. However, since the material world is caused by God's will, it is accepted as real to the extent that it reflects the real world of the spirit. In this way, Gothic philosophers reconciled the apparent opposites, faith and reason. And Gothic artists, blending realism with an expression of ardent spirituality, gave the physical world a new meaning for the faithful. Louis VII was present at the dedication in 1144 of the first great example of Gothic architecture, the Royal Abbey Church of Saint-Denis near Paris. The incumbent abbot, Suger, had rebuilt the centuries-old church, where formerly French kings were traditionally buried. And the new Gothic style, originating at this royal church, became associated with the French monarchy. It arose mainly in the Ile-de-France, with Paris at its center, where many great cathedrals rose up in the space of less than a century. Senlis, Laon, Chartres, Notre-Dame de Paris, Reims, Amiens, Beauvais. The Gothic cathedral was an encyclopedia of Christian theology. Its total structure was a formal expression of the highest aspirations of the times. Its technical triumphs were among the miracles of human ingenuity. Formerly, the great Romanesque abbey churches used ancient engineering solutions. Massive stone walls with only small window openings to support heavy masonry vaults, Roman barrel vaulting, and groin vaulting with its great weight distributed throughout the thick masonry. But Gothic builders, those who built the town cathedrals from the middle of the 12th centuries on in France, invented new ways to lightly vault buildings of much the same plan and size. They developed rib vaulting. The ribs alone now bear the lesser weight of a thin web of masonry that fills the space between them. Then the pointed arch provided a new freedom of construction. A pointed arch can be wide or narrow and yet rise to the same height, while the height of a round arch is determined by its span. As long as the vaulted area was square, Romanesque round arch vaulting was satisfactory. But pointed arches were needed for vaulting the oblong units with which side aisles and other parts were now built. Visually, the pointed arch created a heavenward thrust and an effect of soaring verticality. It was a happy solution. Adopted everywhere, it became the hallmark of what was then modern style, the symbol of a new attitude and the expression of a new order of lightness and light. Gothic lightness and light went hand in hand. The former support of heavy wall masonry was sacrificed for the sake of large windows and more light. But the outward thrust of the building's arches still needed more support than the narrow stone piers provided. The flying buttress was the solution. Springing from a freestanding pier at the lower outer wall beyond the aisles, it throws its structural support to meet and carry the outward thrust of the nave vault, and still admits the daylight. The whole building took on an airy weightlessness and lacy structure that eventually appeared in details of decoration. Solid walls, formerly decorated with paintings, now consisted of stained glass between periodic masonry supports. Windows of varied gem-like colors transformed the light they admitted so that the church interior seemed permeated with a heavenly light of supernatural beauty. The Gothic cathedral was regarded as a celestial enclave, a piece of heaven on earth. This idea of the church as a reflection of heaven had existed for a long time. Romanesque churches often contained the image of heaven painted on interior walls, Christ enthroned, apostles and saints, hosts of angels. But Gothic architects wanted the very form of the construction to symbolize heaven. They dematerialized the walls by piercing their flat surfaces everywhere, and they imposed a new and complicated order of mathematical proportions achieved by geometry, of numerically ordered subdivisions expressive of universal harmony, and a clear expression of the vault construction in colonnettes attached to the piers that often run all the way to the floor. The light of the sun and the harmony of the whole symbolized for Gothic man the universal illumination and harmony of the Christian heaven, where Mary, the mother of Christ, reigned as crowned queen of heaven. In the celestial hierarchy, Christ was king. He was imagined seated on a throne like an earthly king, and indeed, earthly social arrangements were seen as merely an imperfect mirror of heavenly ones. The decoration of the cathedral was no less symbolic than its form. On the outside, sculpture appeared in great profusion and underwent a rich stylistic development. Although the sculpture of human figures had emerged from flat walls into the third dimension, it was not yet ready for emancipation into freestanding reality. It was the medium for presenting and teaching the history of men and the laws of God. At the Cathedral of Chartres, the most typical example of early Gothic art and architecture, we can read this history. Its major feature was the appearance of God on earth in human form. Christ and his doctrine spread by the four evangelists, the writers of the Gospels, presented symbolically and placed on the main west facade above the doors. To the left, Christ's story closes with his ascension from earth to heaven. Below, on the door jambs, are the kings and queens of Judah, Christ's earthly ancestors. These are the earliest sculptures at Chartres, just emerging from the constraints of Romanesque style. Their faces display the serene and gentle expression of the new Gothic manner. Their bodies, stiff, patterned, and elongated, reveal their Romanesque inheritance. The north porch of the cathedral, on the sunless side, was devoted to the Old Testament. Here, history begins with the creation of Adam. Figures of the Old Testament enrich the archivolts. Judith, Tobias and the angel, Esther and Ahasuerus. And flanking the main portal, the prophets who testified to the coming of the Messiah according to Christian scripture. Ending with Simeon, St. John the Baptist, and St. Peter, who bring history up to Christ's lifetime. The whole porch dedicated to the Virgin Mary is dominated by the scene of her coronation in heaven. Scenes of the birth of Christ celebrate the moment in Christian history when the new law succeeded the old. The doorway of the south side, bathed in warm sunlight, continues Christian history through the Acts of the Apostles, the saints, the confessors and doctors of the Church, and finally, towering above all, the end of history and the world, the Last Judgment. In the center of this doorway, teaching and blessing, stands the figure of Christ, whose doctrine promises to prepare the faithful for the day of judgment. He holds the book of life and tramples on the creatures of evil. Under his reign, every department of life is systematized. Time, the zodiac. The seasons, labors of the months. The liberal arts. The virtues. The vices. The type of the medieval knight. The active man of valor, honor, and virtue. The saintly man of God, his face alight with fervor, intelligence, and benign spirit, and many, many others. Inside the cathedral, images in stained glass radiate part of the sacred history. The tree of Jesse recounts the ancestry of Christ according to the prophecy of Isaiah. Evangelists, the writers of the Gospels, supported on the shoulders of Old Testament prophets, symbolize the new truth as prophesied by seers of the old. Inside and out, the whole decoration of the church was a source of wonder and of information for the ordinary man, even though he could not read. From the very plan of the church, which forms the sign of the cross, the central symbol of Christian faith, to the entire cathedral, almost every detail contributes its share of meaning to this huge, complex encyclopedia of Christianity. The facade of Chartres seems primitive and simple compared with the rich, dissolving forms of Reims. A similar development appeared in sculpture. From the figures of the west portal of Chartres to the later work on the north door and the south door, the development is apparent. It reaches a rich and varied expression on the main door of Reims. Here one of the sculptors was evidently aware of the art of classical antiquity. As architectural ornament generated more and more elaborate forms, sculpture, too, moved toward greater complications of its most expressive formal feature, drapery. Gothic figures consist of drapery, of folds and undercuttings and rippling cascades only remotely related to the form and movement of the bodies presumably inside them. By the 14th century, figures took on a swaying and curving posture that accommodated the urge for rhythmic and elaborate ordering of forms. This urge permeated the arts, from crockets and window tracery to finely carved ivories, to manuscript paintings. Its wake is still found in the 15th century, in elegantly sprinkled folds of painted textiles fluttering from swaying figures, and in Burgundian sculpture, now beginning to obey the laws of physical motion and of gravity. The splendid synthesis of religion and art in the Gothic world was destined to be destroyed by the Renaissance, which had already begun to appear in Italy. There was a new worldliness now standing freely in sculpture on this material earth. A worldliness which replaced the Gothic concern for heaven with the pagan ideals of classical antiquity. The Gothic genius flowered most meaningfully in its early stage, in the first flush of a strong and persuasive idea. The continuity of heaven and earth, faith and reason reconciled, a newly formed confidence that the riddle of the universe was solved. This idea provided the energy behind a great and unified style of art that realized its highest achievements in huge communal enterprises, the construction and decoration of the cathedrals. Today, these monuments still perform their original functions as places of worship and serve as the awesome evidence of a time when men and women had the faith that by stepping through a majestic portal, they could enter heaven on earth.